bubbles, dark basement, scuttles, fingernails.
Hi guys, Rose here. Just before we get into this episode, I wanted to remind everyone that if you want to hear more episodes, you can subscribe at greatnorthwitches.com or follow our Facebook group so you can participate in conversations. Great North Witches Collective on Facebook. As well, before we really dig in, just to apologize for all the random noises of my familiars, my two large, always bald cats that don't care about podcasts and just want to be a part of everything. So sorry for the extraneous noise. I hope it doesn't detract from the interesting information that we'll be sharing with you today. Hey witches, it's Rose here, your traditional astrologer and hedge witch, and we're bringing you Astrology for Witches. This is a monthly episode that we'll be putting out to review the big transits of the month and how they apply to our magic. And with me, I have the lovely George.
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me. My name is George. I have been an astrology hobbyist for like around a year now. So just joining this podcast, just chipping in. But I'm really excited, for the trajectory of like the discussions that we might have. And yeah, that's basically a one minute introduction on who I am.
Oh, and if you know George, there's so much more to know, but we will get there with this podcast. We are going to start out with a little topic of pros and cons of astrology. And the reason I wanted to add this to our regular podcast where we talk about witch issues is that personally, as a longtime practicer of astrologer and someone who reads birth charts and uses transits, so the way the planets are moving through the sky, I really notice that in your magic practice, knowing a little bit about astrology will really impact and improve your magic. And it'll also help with a lot of those spells that kind of seem to not work or fall apart. And it also just is it's better if we can recognize the energy that's happening around us so that we can know whether, it's a personal thing that's going on or whether it's more of like a planetary experience where we're all kind of experiencing that, whether it's Mercury in retrograde or some other difficult thing happening in the sky. So we wanted to talk about the pros and cons of astrology just to start, and then we'll go through the main transits of this month to help everyone use their magic and just go about their lives. And so I'm going to ask George what your biggest pro and con for astrology is.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Me and you were just talking about it right before we started the podcast. And we were trying to discuss about how a witch could actually include astrology in her own spiritual practice. And I feel like we just kind of reached a conclusion where it just makes sense, right? Because if you listen to the last podcast that we did, there was a discussion of being a witch as being an energy conduit, but astrology is all about interpreting the energies that are around us. So it just makes sense, right? If we know that astrology is kind of like this collective wisdom that's been built upon tens of thousands of years, and if we can agree that this knowledge and wisdom has been gained through what messages the planets are telling us, then it naturally follows that we can use what kind of messages the planets are wanting to tell us about the heavenly, I guess, kind of like spiritual realm that you can access and that you can interpret and that you can talk about with other people. And also, just like how you said, you can actually kind of time your spells right so that you can make sure that you're not actually doing a spell in a time where it's not very harmonious for that energy to actually sort to be actioned upon or to be manifested or anything like that. So that's like the biggest pro. I think the biggest, it depends on what you would say is a con, because it's almost like the biggest strengths that astrology have could also probably be its biggest weakness in the fact that astrology it can predict, but a lot of people with that strength of prediction kind of feel like everything is like their free will doesn't exist, and I kind of don't want that. I don't want people to feel that way.
Do you get caught up in that yourself sometimes?
Well, it is a very common misconception, and I feel, and obviously like I'm new to this, but I feel like the biggest misconception is that people think that planets are like directly influencing us, when it's not really. It really isn't about that. It's kind of like looking at a clock, and you're looking at it, and you're just interpreting what it's saying, right?
Like the clock doesn't make it 2:00. But the clock tells
telling you that it's 2:00.
It's not making the time happen. Yeah.
Exactly. So
that's interesting.
In other words, planets are not affective, they are reflective, right? They are kind of like a mirror on what is happening into our own lives, that it was already going to happen anyway, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of what people usually don't get at the first start. They usually think that it's affective. They think that, oh shit, like if I'm gonna have this transit in this time, then it's gonna be chaos, and it's gonna be this and that.
Yeah.
Or I'm gonna have a great day. It could be also positive. I'm just like, but then you get
a bad day.
And you're like, what my expectations? So
you promised me.
exactly. So it's really just about, think about the history of it. Imagine our ancestors looking up onto the sky, looking at it as if it's a mirror on what is happening above is happening below.
The adage. Yeah.
Exactly. And just remember the fact that it is a language. It is a way into which we can interpret our own lives, our own human psyche, so that we can go deeper.
Yeah.
It's a conduit in order for us to go deeper, not so that it can explain everything that it is.
And I think that's a great point, because a lot of people think, is it a science, is it an art? But astrologers who practice long enough do always say it's a language. It's an interpretation of signs and symbols, right? Which I think is really beautiful, because witchcraft itself is also an interpretation of signs and symbols, right? Like people are like, oh, I saw this kind of bird today, or this plant represents this to me, so I'm going to use it in a spell. So it's astrology is just like the biggest objects you could possibly interpret.
Yeah, it's a tool. It's a tool so that we can go deeper into what is beyond just the surface, right? Is so that we can just kind of go into these cavernous versions, like areas of our minds, and actually explore like our actual it's just basically a language to explore human consciousness, is what I would say. And people usually take that in the wrong way, and we're just here to set it straight.
Lovely. And I was going to say, I did want to point out that George is not a practicing witch, more of a spiritualist. Is that
accurate? A spiritualist, of course.
Did listening to the recording about what is a witch help change your ideas, that maybe you do have more of a connection with witchcraft, if it's not in that narrow like Hollywood standard that some of us did? I don't know if you noticed that when you're listening to it.
I if anything, it actually only just deepened my knowledge of what being a witch is. I mean, obviously I don't lay claim to that label, not because I feel that I'm not spiritual. It's just because there is sort of like a feminine aspect of being a witch, and I like to respect that. I wouldn't lay claim to that identity, but I definitely do say that I am a spiritualist. And not only that, but I've been learning traditional Hellenistic astrology,
which can have a magic component as well.
Exactly. And I've been also using traditional whole sign houses and kind of incorporate that with human psychology, because I always want to anchor it on so what does this mean? Why is this relevant? What does it matter for me? Right.
And I like to point out to people, because I think a lot of people don't understand just a very, very brief history of astrology, where there are books and proof of its existence, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. And there's proof of, elephants doing moon rituals now. So clearly astrology is something that is innate in any thinking creature. So it has been going on forever. The challenge is that during the burning times, as we call them, 1400s, 1600s, and then, some over in the States later, a lot of that knowledge was either buried or lost. And once that passed and it became acceptable again to do these kind of practices, they were trying to find a way to essentially sell astrology in the newspapers, because print media had become very popular. It was much quicker now. They had printing presses. So they invented what I refer to as sun sign astrology. Most people you talk to will say to you, oh, I know I'm a Capricorn, oh, I know I'm a Sagittarius. And it's important to know that on the moment you were born, all the planets were in the sky and they were all in their own signs, and that what signs they were in have an impact to you. So it's easy for us to think in sun sign astrology, but I think it is really important for people to pull up their birth chart and see where their other planets were, because where the planets are now will really impact those planets when they ride over top of them, or if they make certain positions to them. We don't need to get into that too much, but I'll put a link at the bottom of the podcast, because I think it's important for everyone to pull up their birth chart and at least know where your main planets are at the time you're born. Because that way, when we tell you, like, Mercury is retrograding in Virgo, and you know you have a bunch of stuff in Virgo, it's like, okay, well, it's probably going to impact me more because it's hitting on all these planets that were in Virgo when I was born. So I hope everyone will at least consider knowing that much. And if you want to dig deeper, you can. But I think, especially for witches, it's important to, at the bare minimum, know where your sun is, know where your moon is, and know where your rising sign is. So if you can get a hold of your birth time, it's going to make a huge difference in how you interact with astrology. And it's going to deepen you, because I think the challenge I have with sun sign astrology, and I don't know if this is true for you too, George, but I really hate the idea of dividing people into 12 groups.
Right.
And just being like, and now you're all Sagittarius. And then everyone goes, it's not true because my friend's a Sagittarius, but I'm nothing like them. And you're like, well, yeah.
Of course you're not.
You have a lot of other planets. Yeah. Who knows? It just adds so many layers. So if you're ready, we'll get into the... Do you want to do the astrology?
Just one thing before we dive deep, because I thank you so much for actually pointing that out. Actually, that we're not just 12 different people around the world. It's so much more complex than that, and the reason why is just because how you mentioned it. We're always talking about the chart. We're talking about the chart entirely in its entirety, and what it means is that we are looking at the signs that are across the ecliptic, just to kind of like set the stage before we go really deeper into the signs for people who are new to this. The signs that are in your chart are signs that are that the sun actually crosses.
They're the constellations along the line that the sun travels from the Earth's perspective.
Exactly. And that is what we call the band of the ecliptic, or the band of the heavens. And
they actually, and I think in the old Greek, they used to call it the parade of animals, even though not all of the zodiac signs are animals, but I always thought that was lovely. And I mean... there's a whole bunch of little nuances, because there's sidereal, where they literally look at where the stars are, whereas the kind of astrology we practice in the West is tropical, and it's actually based a little bit more on the seasons, because we let the spring equinox and the fall equinox and the summer solstice and the winter solstice decide where our zodiac signs begin. But the reason that I love that is because in most witchcraft we honor these seasons and these changes, so it plays in a lot better to the witchcraft practice, I find, just because we're always about becoming aware of the cycles and the natural changes that are happening within nature. So Western astrology seems a little more lined up with that than maybe the sidereal or East Indian version. We're going to start off at the beginning of the month, right at October 2nd. Mercury is going to go direct at 24 degrees Virgo. And if you don't know about degrees, don't worry about it. Just think Virgo. So I would love to ask George, because I don't have a ton of Mercury placements and I don't have a lot of stuff in Virgo. How is this Mercury retrograde for you?
Oh my God. I've been struggling quite a bit. And it's not because not only that, I'm just very sensitive to Mercury retrogrades in general, because I'm a Gemini rising, and Gemini is ruled by Mercury. So for those who don't know, the signs, every single sign in the zodiac is ruled by a specific planet. And Gemini specifically is ruled by Mercury, the planet of communication, the planet of exchange of ideas, just like exchanging just about anything. Could even be like exchange of currency or exchange of value, or just basically the planet of communication and thoughts and ideas, and just kind of like our mental faculties, right? And all of that has been in retrograde, especially in Libra. So
Yeah.
that's a sign. That's a sign that usually deals with traditional things like relationships. It also deals with partnerships. Could even be like business partnerships, or even be obviously romantic, but also sexual partnerships. Really, just about anything that
anything
that
relationship related is
exactly
the sign. So just to clarify for people, Mercury started in Libra, and then it went backwards into Virgo. And so just because we didn't mention that, sorry, I didn't mention that, but that kind of changes the flavor of the retrograde, because when Mercury was in Libra, our minds were going to be much more focused on relationships and balance in our lives, and often contractual interactions that we have with other people. And then it retrograded back into Virgo. So in theory, the end of the retrograde should have felt a little better, because Mercury rules Virgo.
Mm-hmm.
So that gives it a little bit of a like uplift. And then once it goes forward on October 2nd, it'll finally start to really move again around October 6th. So we call that like the shadow period, where it's kind of staying still. Once it starts kicking into forward motion again, we're going to start to feel a lot better. And I think it's really important for people to know with retrogrades, the period that the planet is not moving is the strongest. So we call that stationing. Beginning of the retrograde and at the end of the retrograde, Mercury doesn't really move spots in the sky. If you want to imagine, it's kind of like a pendulum. The stationary points are the top of the pendulum. So if you've ever seen a pendulum go back and forth, when it hits that top, it looks like it freezes in the air. And that's kind of what Mercury is doing. And when it does that, it gives it that extra oomph, because it's just sitting still. And it's kind of like it has extra gravity. During like the October 2nd period, it's going to be that much heavier. So even if we've kind of had a lightening on our Mercury retrograde feel, it gets a little bit heavier at the end. And then once it gets out of that shadow period, October 6th, things should start to move again. Computers should be a little better. I don't promise anyone anything. The challenge that we're having right now is that Mars is going through Gemini, and it doesn't like being in there. That's another Mercury ruled sign. And it's also squaring, which is like a really funny position to have to the Mercury sign, because it kind of like slows everything down and it messes it up. So just to try to speak in the most layman possible way, but essentially, not only are we having Mercury retrograde, but we're having these interactions between Mars and Mercury, which, because Gemini and Virgo, which are the two Mercury signs, is where these planets are so thought orientated and so innervated and just so focused on just like our day-to-day minute life details. You put Mars in there and it's like this fighting, warring planet. It can just blow up all our thoughts, and to the point that we're all anxious and we're all super anticipating. Like you just feel like you're always waiting for something to happen. But that's part of the retrograde. I just don't want to get people too excited that things are going to get super awesome right away, because unfortunately Mars is in Gemini for quite a while, and it just kind of is part of that energy too. It's not like a quick everything will be better. I hate to be negative, but I also hate to lie and then have everyone be like, oh, we got to the end of Mercury retrograde. Why isn't everything better? Because Mars is a big part of why this retrograde has seemed, I think, for people heavier and stronger than usual. So we can't just ignore the fact that Mars is still doing what it's doing even when this retrograde ends.
So let's just first actually understand what retrogrades are in general. Because retrogrades are just basically like an optical illusion, and the best way that I can describe is, have you ever noticed that when you're just kind of like driving past a car and you're driving faster than that car, it kind of seems like that car kind of like moves backwards? That's almost what's happening to the relative like perspective that we as humans have when the planets, it's almost like the Earth is kind of like catching up to the speed of these planets, and we're kind of like going beyond it. So there's no such thing when you look at space, like in general, like astronomy wise, there's no such thing as like a planet moving
that actually goes backwards,
right? Yeah, the planets don't actually go backwards. What's happening is that when the ancients looked up to the sky and they looked at how these specific they actually mentioned them as stars. They didn't really know that they were separate planets, just like the Earth is.
They called them wandering stars.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why they were the messengers of the heavenly bodies. What retrogrades usually mean is a period of internal reflection, right? So especially with Mercury, a lot of our processing, our communication, it happens externally, right? That's usually when it goes direct. But when it's retrograde, we turn all of that energy inwards, right? So we're a little bit more introspective and a little bit more reflective. And what are we reflective about? Well, we look at what the sign it's in that actually that can give us more detail about what we're trying to be a little bit more conscientious about. And Libra is the sign, just like how we mentioned, the sign of relationship. So we're getting a lot of, I guess, like you could say, energetic downloads, but also just realizations and just lessons that we would have learned during the Mercury retrograde during Libra. And now that it's going to be stationing direct tomorrow, October 2nd, we're going to take all of those lessons that we're going to be learning from Libra, and we're going to implement them, and we're going to organize them. Hello, Virgo. Virgo energy, the energy of trying to assess things and analyze them and categorize them. I mean, I'm a Virgo sun and Virgo moon, so trust me, honey. Yeah, this is the kind of like the general, I guess you could say, feeling that's going to happen in that specific day. So that's something that we can look forward to.
Yeah, I love it. Next, we have a full moon in Aries at 16 degrees on October 9th. Now, we have eclipses at the end of the month, which are going to be much bigger things, but I know with witchcraft, we love our full moons. And we love making our moon water. And I think it's really important to be aware that the cycle of things is really important in astrology, just like it is in witchcraft. So a lot of people like to do spells and stuff on a full moon because the moon has full power. In astrology, I often find myself looking more at the cycle of the moon. Now, with a new moon, we like to start new projects, and then with full moon, we like to reap the benefit. What's really important to know is that when you get a full moon in Aries, there was a new moon 6 months earlier in Aries as well. So these moon patterns start on a 6-month cycle where you get the new moon, where you initiate things, and then a full moon where you're supposed to reap the benefits, or things culminate, or you start to review the benefits or negatives of the choices you made with the new moon. So you might notice this pattern in your life naturally, but it's something we can use in our spell work, where we start something 6 months prior and then continue to build our magic until we're ready to reap 6 months later. You can do your moon water, you can do all that. It is an Aries moon, which means that any moon water you make might be a little fierier than you're used to making. Did you have any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, no, plenty of thoughts for sure. Well, I mean, I guess we could start at trying to talk about what it is what full moons just generally mean. What happens at a full moon is that the sun is directly opposite to the moon, right? So the sun is reflecting all of its energy, all of its sunlight to the moon, and the moon is reflecting it back into the earth. And because there is that inherent opposition, always when we have oppositions, there is always kind of like that seesaw energy where you're kind of like being tugged into at one point or like one axis or the other, right?
Yeah, and it is on the relationship axis.
Right.
Aries and
Libra. Exactly. Yeah. So whenever we look at even a new moon or even like a full moon, we look at the axis. So, okay, so what is happening at this Aries Libra axis? Well, because it's actually at Aries is the sign of the self. Aries is a sign of the subjective, right? The subjective experience. And if we can agree that the moon is about our emotions, our hidden subconscious, then our subconscious is going to usually reveal aspects of our own subjective experiences, and we're going to be feeling those things a lot more. It's going to rise into the surface,
True.
Right? Whatever
full moons bring up a lot of
exactly,
emotion.
Exactly, and this, especially in this full moon in Aries, or whatever. Because if the moon is the collective unconscious, it's going to surface into the collective consciousness, which is the sun. Again, the Aries actually exalts the sun. So we know that there's that aspect of Aries that is about the ego, the identity, right? So we're probably going to be a little bit more personal when it comes to things and considerations that are happening not only with ourselves but with other people around us, right? Again, the Aries Libra axis, this is highlighted in our life.
Yeah, and we notice with a lot of the other transits, it's like a relationship month, like whether we want it to be or not, which is not shocking because when you have Libra, the sun traveling through Libra, like it is for this month, for most of it anyways, it's hard not to think about I call it our contracts with other people, and I don't mean our legal contracts, but every relationship you have with another person is a contract in the sense that you're going to have expectations for how things are supposed to go. And then you're trying to figure out, did I make a good deal, right? So I think that's going to come up again and again, especially right after our full moon, unless there's anything else you want to say about the full moon.
Just a little bit more about Libra before we get into it. So every single planet has a inherent dignity that we assign to
the ruling planet, and also...
its essential dignity is what we say. So... do also remember that Saturn is also exalted in Libra. And just like how you said, Libra is also about contracts. Well, Saturn is also about the kind of like the karmic footprint that we have. So remember that Libra also has that element where we are also assessing what kind of karmic footprint are we leaving when we are having these relationships with other people. That's also what Libra is. Libra is the fall of the sun. It is putting aside the ego in order to reach harmony and balance for other. Exactly. Yeah. And Aries is also about balance, right? Aries is about balance, but it's also about uplifting the ego in order to have harmony with others. Libra is about putting aside the ego in order to have harmony. So it's also about, because they are actually at that axis where the sun actually goes below and above the horizon, right? The Libra is a scale.
They're the turning point, for the sun when it's traveling. Well, it looks like it's going above and below for us.
The vernal and the autumn equinox.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then right after that, we get the sun squaring Pluto on October 19th at 26 degrees Libra. And following soon after that, on the 20th, so the next day, we have Venus squaring Pluto. So I just want to explain quickly about squares without getting too deeply into it. Some of the major positions in the sky are conjunctions, which is when two planets are in the same area of the sky, and usually the energy kind of melds together to make a new sort of energy. Oppositions, which George spoke about earlier, is when planets are on the opposite ends of the sky. And they usually create sort of a push and pull energy as if we're getting tugged between both of them. A square is a right angle. So you kind of want to think of the energy of if you were driving down the road and there was a really strong crosswind where you kind of have to keep righting yourself onto the path you're heading on because there's another force that's trying to push you sideways. And that's similar to how squares work, where it's just sort of a sideways push in a different direction than you were planning on going. So all this is happening in Libra. Again, so we're talking about that relationship focus. But what's interesting is when you have interaction with Pluto, like we're going to have, Pluto is essentially, he's our Hades god. So a lot of times when you have interactions with Pluto or Hades, part of the transformation is very much about going into the darkest part of yourself and reworking everything and then coming back out into the sunshine in a whole nother form. Squares aren't as strong as like a conjunction where all the planets are together, but they still have the ability to kind of wake up our need to make big transformations in our life. So when you have the sun, which is kind of the symbol of the ego and the personal spirit and the self goal, hitting a square with Pluto, followed by Venus, which is our planet of love and connection and communion with other people, as well as ourselves. It just tells me that we're going to have a lot of big changes about what we want to do with ourselves and how we interact with people around us. I don't know if you found that when you were looking at the transits.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely found that same thing, especially because when you're looking at Pluto, you're looking at a planet that almost represents, just like how you said, the very, very deepest parts of our psyche, right? And what that usually means is things like, psychological complexes or neuroses that we would have in our subconscious mind. So because of that part that Pluto represents, it's going to be squaring off with the sun, our collective consciousness. So that is also almost just like the new moon, almost it's going to have things that we previously probably didn't really realize were kind of like inherent within our subconscious, kind of rise a little bit into and surface a little bit into what we actually understand. And what we know that Pluto represents as well. Pluto also represents authority. So we might kind of have this energy, a little bit of a friction with authority, maybe a little bit in that specific day on October 20th, the 19th at Libra. And not only that, but Pluto is also the planet of manipulation and control. And with the sign that it's in, maybe we might have this urge or this tendency to try to control people who we are in a relationship with, right? And remember that in Pluto's, like, it's a little bit neurotic in that sense. So maybe you would have this desire to be controlling. Maybe maybe the planets are asking us to reconsider that, right? Just try to know that might be an urge that might surface into your just general
day-to-day.
Exactly, and just try to know that it's there. Squares are not really that difficult. It's usually just kind of like an energy of friction.
Yeah, they're not the same as an opposition or a conjunction, but they still make a little noise. And what's interesting is when I was looking at all these transits, the way it plays out, because we have the sun squaring Pluto, then we have Venus squaring Pluto, and then Venus enters the sun. And in astrology, when planets pass through the sun, we call it like the rebirthing or essentially the purifying of the planet, and it starts a new cycle. All of this plays in because here we have these themes with Pluto where it's about transformation and new beginnings, and we have Venus doing this conjunction with the sun where it's going to be reborn, and then right after its rebirth it's heading into Scorpio, which in Hellenistic or ancient astrology was ruled by Mars, but in current astrology we often consider it ruled by Pluto. So we have that Pluto element, but then we're looking at the Mars factor, which is really important with Venus. Venus and Mars are kind of opposites. Mars is our warlike planet and Venus is our love-like planet. But I do think it's going to cause some good changes in the sense that I think it's sometimes beneficial when Venus and Mars come together, because sometimes Venus can be a little too compliant, like it is in Libra. Be a little bit too giving, it can be a little bit too obedient. And when you get it in a Mars sign, it's kind of gives it a little bit of that female warrior vibe. And with everything that's been going on lately in the legal system with women's rights and stuff like that, I do think there is some benefit to Venus being reborn into a sign that gives it a little bit more of a fight. And I'm hoping it doesn't end up being just a lot of women feeling controlled. I'm hoping it ends up being people working with feminine energy to gain back power. I'm hoping. Anyways, we'll see what happens.
No, I love that. I love what you said, especially what you mentioned about it being basically in the last degree. And usually when we see at the last degree, it's almost like this energy where it's that final push before giving birth, right?
Yeah.
You're a mother, right? Like, you know how incredibly hard it is to go through that process of labor. And when planets are in that very last degree of a specific sign, it's kind of like that arduous kind of like oomph that you have to do in order for you to actually pass through the next sign. And that's why I kind of feel like astrology almost has its own poetry in a way, because not only is it happening and it's squaring with Pluto, and Pluto is also the planet that rules things like rebirth and themes of transformation, not just regular transformation, like very deep, intense, like life and rebirth transformation, right?
Yes.
So if we're dealing with a square with Pluto, we're usually dealing with themes that are arising when it comes to change. So when Venus is interacting as a square with Pluto, usually we would need to contend with the changes that are happening with the relationships that we have in our lives, just in general. And we need to just kind of like acknowledge that there is nothing that is permanent in this life, and that Pluto tries to teach us in a way, even though it is a planet that is associated with Hades. Pluto actually does want to be in our favor in the fact that it wants to show us how our desires to be subversive towards the people who are in our lives is a very deep and innate, almost like within our human psyche. It's like it's a very
strong pull.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what Pluto tries to teach us, right? That's the spiritual lesson that Pluto tries to teach us.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah,
and I just want to tell for our witches, you're going to feel a lot of urge to do transformational spells and relationship spells right now. And usually when Venus is joining with the sun, I would say go for it. But I'm going to say I would not be doing any major spells that relate to other people right now, or making big changes for yourself. Because what's going to happen on October 25th is that Venus that is still traveling along with the sun, they haven't really separated yet, is going to head into Scorpio, be at 2 degrees Scorpio, and it's going to be an eclipse. So I know for witches this is not uncommon for people to be like, yes, an eclipse, a big powerful thing, I'm going to do big powerful magic. But what a lot of people don't realize is that eclipses can give you very powerful magic, but it can give you very powerful magic in a direction that you are not expecting. So I just worry about people doing love spells during this time or any super transformational magic. I don't want them to end up with a stalker or like a crazy relationship that's not right for them because they were like, oh, this is the time, I can feel it. And then when they do the magic, it blows back on them. So I'm not saying don't do any magic. This time, this kind of magic right now, like the kind of stuff you want to be focusing on is clearing magic. Any kind of magic that's releasing parts of yourself that you don't want anymore, it's a lot harder to have that blow back in a negative way. Just because it's, you're not trying to make something happen, you're trying to let go of what is already happening. So that would be my big thing for you guys. Don't do magic. Probably, I would even consider not doing any majorly powerful spells for probably 2 weeks after the eclipse. If anyone has anything at 2 Scorpio, you're going to notice this a lot louder than other people. So just wanted to give everyone the heads up that now is not the time to be, trying to convince the love of your life that he shouldn't leave you. Like, just, if it happens, wait a couple weeks, maybe then consider your spells.
That's, truer words have never been spoken, for sure.
So I don't know if you've had any huge eclipse stories, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on them.
Eclipses, they really, it's almost like portals that are opening. I would actually, interestingly enough, I would actually be grateful for the eclipse that happened not too long ago. I believe there was one in Pisces, and it was actually conjunct Neptune. And that was when I realized that I wanted to be a spiritual person and that I wanted to invest in my spirituality. So there's always that feeling where when there's an eclipse, our ancestors just kind of like looked at the sky and they noticed that there is like this marvelous kind of like thing that's happening. And what's happening really is that the nodes are being conjunct with the moon as well as the sun. And in this coming month, not only is that happening, but it's also going to be conjunct with Venus. So
yeah, and just to explain to people, because the nodes aren't an actual planet, what they are is the point that the moon crosses the path of the sun in the sky, essentially. And there's a north node and there's a south node. They come in a pair. North nodes usually send energy towards things, and south nodes can be draining. So this eclipse is happening on the south node, which is a little more draining, and it's more likely for things to kind of for everything to be sucked out of you.
Right.
Then if it was at the north node, I'd be more worried about things exploding on you. So, I mean, in some ways, maybe that's beneficial that, there's less energy, but for sure take care of yourself during this eclipse, because Scorpio eclipses are some of the heaviest, some of the most transformational. You have the south node there. It's got Venus, so it's like your connective energy. It's a lot of emotion with the moon as well, all happening at the same time. So definitely self-care. I know we say it all the time, but something to consider.
Yeah, and if it's okay with you, I'll just add really quickly that just like how you said, yes, they are not actual planets, they are just mathematical points, right? If you look at the apparent kind of orbit that the moon and the sun have based on the Earth, the points in which they intersect are the nodes and the south node. And they are based on this mythology where the north node would basically be the head of the snake and the south node would basically be its body. So it's almost like the south node is kind of like almost like Saturn. It kind of has that karmic element to it.
Yeah, they often associate
theme.
the south node with Saturn and Mars.
Right.
Yeah.
So because of the fact that Scorpio is a sign of resistance to vulnerability and trust, so those themes are going to be highlighted in this time of the year. We're going to be looking a little bit more inwards, actually, about how we trust people, how we kind of put ourselves and just kind of wear our hearts on our sleeves. How does that impact us? Does that benefit us, or does that actually make us like in a low vibration? Right?
Yeah, that's true. It's gonna be we'll have to next month do a little review and see how things went, because I'm excited to see what changes come during this time. I find often eclipses are beginnings and endings too, so it'll be neat to see what's born and neat to see what's kind of fallen away. And the last big transit we have this October is right at the end of October 30th, at 25 Gemini. Mars is starting its retrograde. And we talked about it at the beginning, so this is nice because we're kind of coming back. Mars and Gemini. So Gemini is this kind of dry sign, and Mars is this hot, dry planet. And Gemini is that sign of the thinking, of the nervous system. So it's common when Mars is in Gemini to feel frazzled, to feel overwhelmed. Sometimes because Mars really wants to go forward fast, but now it's going slow because it's getting ready to retrograde. It can feel like you are going in fits and starts, where one day you're super high energy and you're thinking about everything, and the next day you're just like, oh my God, I can't move. That's totally part of it. But I did want to point out that it entered Gemini in August. So I know a lot of people have been feeling a lot of heaviness since August, because first we started out with Mars conjoining the North Node and Uranus back in August. And there was a lot of big things that came from that. But I mean, we don't want to go back too far. But essentially, then it headed into Gemini, which is a hard sign for it. And because it's retrograding through there, it's going to be hanging out there until, I believe, until March. The retrograde will end in January. But the point is that this is a challenging thing for a lot of people who have either a lot of Mercury placements, a lot of stuff in Gemini, or a lot of stuff in Virgo, because then you're getting that square to Virgo. So just so everyone's aware that if you're feeling that kind of super frazzled energy or dried out or just like overwhelmed, it will pass. And that's one of the most important things about astrology, is to realize that you're not having a mental breakdown necessarily. You might be, but it's because there's a bigger thing going on and it's not a permanent thing. So I like to suggest to people, if you like things like licorice tea, and I mean real licorice root, not eating black licorice, if you get some licorice tea, it's really great for holding in hydration, because the more water you keep in your system, the less frazzled you're going to feel. There's something called marshmallow root I often like to suggest for people. It's really good for keeping you hydrated. If you go to one of your health food stores, they'll have it as a kind of tea you can drink. I would suggest that to people. Water in general is just going to really help you out for the next couple months. All the way to March would be great. If you could drink water till March. I know it's not a thing everyone likes to do, but I would definitely consider it. And then the other thing is, make sure you have some sort of outlet, because Mars is an action planet. So that means if you do things that keep you moving and keep that energy flowing, it's going to be a lot better. And because it's in Gemini, I would say invite all your friends over and do like a really lively game of Pictionary or something, where you have to think and move around a lot and shout, but don't actually get angry at each other, because it's still just Pictionary. That would be a really good use of that Mars and Gemini energy, because you're going to feel inspired to be angry at everyone for a bit. It's not you. It's just that Mars energy needs to go somewhere. What are you even thinking about for this?
It's so funny. I'm just like, yes, and yes. Every single time I'm just like, oh yeah, Mars and Gemini, like the whole entire theme of kind of like trying to choose a particular argument as if like you're choosing your fighter, right? Kind of like, because the Mars is the fighter, just like how you said Mars is an action planet, right? And Gemini, well, let's look at Gemini a little bit. Gemini is mutable air, right? It's kind of like it's the bubbles rising up, and it's chaotic energy, right?
Yeah.
So just thinking of this a little bit rationally, a little bit logically, you can definitely see how being the planet of action isn't necessarily conducive when it's like
going
like
backwards?
chaotic, yeah, exactly, and just kind of like bubbling up like Gemini's energy is, right? So we might actually feel like our motivation, our drive, our willpower is probably going to be pulled in a lot of different directions, and probably going to be expanded, right?
Like eternally expanded, because it's the retrograde,
because
right?
it's a retrograde, right? And all of the Gemini kind of qualities of it being the sign of communication is always also just like how you said, it's basically just kind of like looking at a particular argument or a particular ideology and choosing that as the film, and like
Gemini
having an
loves
argument
to pull
by
everything
it,
apart, right? It's
Yeah.
like, here, how can I pull out all the little details of this fight and
Exactly.
think about them forever?
Exactly. And not only that, but particularly with this retrograde, it's going to be for 7 months, and Mars doesn't usually.
Well, it's in Gemini for 7 months.
Exactly.
The retrograde is end of October to beginning of I think it's January 11th. Sorry, I don't have it off the top of my head.
True.
But,
yeah.
But in Gemini in general, it's challenging,
Exactly.
and the retrograde's like the.
Yeah. But it will kind of like have those themes of the retrograde all throughout, like the Gemini kind of period that Mars is going to be in, because honestly I've been feeling it.
Well,
like,
it's slower right now, and like I said, a lot of people think what's hard about the retrogrades is that planets are backwards, but often what's really challenging is the planets aren't moving. So it's like if someone stepped on you. It hurts a lot more if they don't get off, right? Like they're standing there and you're like, okay, can we be done now?
I get it. Like I don't have energy like when I wake up in the morning. I'm just like, oh my god. So honestly, with people who have Gemini placements, especially witches, what I would really recommend for you to do is to kind of like look at your energy as if like you have 10 spoons that you have to spend in the day.
The spoon theory is one of everyone's favorites.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then I want you to reduce that by half.
Yes, you now have 5 spoons
exactly.
for the next few months.
And you're going to delegate those spoons very accordingly, because I want you to not spend your energy too much. Mars in Gemini is very, very easily very highly combustible, very chaotic. So just make sure that you are spending your energy wisely, and that's basically the advice that I would have.
I love it. Yeah, you got to get to the end of the day. Nothing worse than running out of spoons.
Right? Oh my god.
Can't get another spoon.
I need more cutlery.
Yeah, I love it. Well, I think that's a great summary of what's going to be coming up this month. And we're getting it out a little bit late. We'll try to get it out so you guys have more time to listen before the month starts. But luckily, the really big, impactful transits are going to be happening at the end of the month. So hopefully everyone makes sure that they're hydrating, as we like to remind everyone, counting their spoons. And do you have any other advice for everyone?
Yeah, definitely drink a lot of water.
Love it.
It's always a bonus.
Yeah. All right. We'll catch you guys next time. Hey guys, I hope you all enjoyed our summary of the astrological transits that happen in October, and that it helps you think about what magic you will be using this month. If you want to hear further podcasts, be sure to follow us at greatnorthwitches.com or become part of our Facebook group, Great North Witches Collective, and we'll see you there.